For 23 years, I was a respected elder until I uncovered that the very system preaching purity was hiding predators behind the pulpit. What I witnessed in secret meetings could shatter entire families, and when I spoke up, they threatened to erase me from existence. But the truth I hold is darker than you could ever imagine. My name is Raymond Mitchell, and for 23 years I wore the title of Elder in the Jehovah's Witnesses like a badge of honor. I was 61 years old when everything I believed came crashing down, and I want you to understand what that means. When you're an elder, you're not just a member. You're part of the machinery that keeps the organization running. You make decisions that affect entire families. You sit in judicial committees that can tear apart marriages, separate parents from children, and destroy lifelong friendships with a single announcement from the platform. I lived in Millbrook, a small town in northern Michigan, where our Kingdom Hall sat on Elm Street like a fortress of righteousness. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, every Sunday morning, you'd find me there in my pressed suit and perfectly knotted tie, briefcase in hand, ready to shepherd the flock. The brothers and sisters looked up to me. Children would run to hug me after meetings. Young men sought my counsel about their spiritual goals. I was respected, trusted, needed. I thought I was serving God. The Watchtower Society had trained me well. I could recite doctrine like scripture, explain complex prophecies with charts and timelines, and conduct Bible studies that would convince skeptics to abandon their holidays, their careers, their families if necessary, all for the promise of paradise on earth. I believed every word of it. When the organization said blood transfusions were forbidden, I enforced it. When they said celebrating birthdays was pagan, I made sure no one in our congregation wavered. When they demanded that members report each other for wrongdoing, I called it spiritual protection. Looking back now, I see how perfectly the system worked. We weren't just believers, we were enforcers of belief. Every meeting reinforced the same message. We alone had the truth. The world was controlled by Satan. And questioning the organization was tantamount to questioning God himself. The governing body in Brooklyn spoke, and we obeyed without hesitation. They called it theocratic order. I called it beautiful. Now I know it was control, pure and simple. My wife Margaret had been by my side through it all. We'd converted together. In our 30s, leaving behind our Methodist upbringing for what we believed was a purer form of Christianity. She became a regular pioneer, spending 70 hours a month knocking on doors, placing magazines, conducting Bible studies with interested ones. Our daughter Sarah grew up in the truth, baptized at 14, married to a ministerial servant at 19. Our son Daniel served at Bethel headquarters for 3 years before returning to pioneer in our home congregation. We were the model witness family, the ones other families aspired to be. The first crack in my foundation came during a judicial committee meeting in the autumn of 2018. A young woman named Jennifer, barely 20 years old, sat across from us, 3 elders, tears streaming down her face as she confessed to what the organization called sexual immorality. She'd been dating a non-witness boy from her college, and their relationship had become physical. According to our rules, this warranted potential disfellowshipping, complete shunning by every Jehovah's Witness she'd ever known, including her own family. But as Jennifer spoke, something didn't sit right with me. She described how isolated she'd felt, how the constant pressure to pioneer and attend meetings had left her emotionally drained. She talked about her struggle with depression, her desperate need for human connection outside the restrictive world of the organization. The boy she'd been seeing was kind, supportive, everything she'd been told worldly people weren't supposed to be. And here we sat, 3 older men, preparing to cut her off from everyone she'd ever loved because she'd found comfort in his arms. The other 2 elders were ready to disfellowship her immediately. Brother Johnson, the presiding overseer, quoted scripture about keeping the congregation clean. Brother Williams nodded along, adding his own comments about the dangers of bad associations. But I found myself asking questions that surprised even me. Why couldn't she date someone who wasn't a witness? Why did expressing natural human affection warrant such severe punishment? What about forgiveness, mercy, love? They looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Johnson reminded me of our training, the organizational procedures we were bound to follow. Williams quoted the Watchtower study from the previous month about maintaining congregational purity. But their words felt hollow, mechanical, devoid of the compassion I'd always believed our religion embodied. That night, I went home troubled in a way I'd never experienced before. Margaret noticed my distress over dinner. When I tried to explain my concerns about the Judicial Committee, she gently reminded me of our vows of obedience to the faithful and discreet slave, the governing body's term for themselves. She quoted familiar verses about trusting in Jehovah's organization, not leaning on our own understanding. Her response was everything I'd been trained to give in similar situations, but hearing it directed at me felt different. It felt dismissive, automatic, programmed. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I read the Bible without any Watchtower publications, without any organizational literature to guide my understanding. Just the raw text, the words I'd claimed to base my entire life upon. What I found there didn't match what I'd been teaching for over 2 decades. Jesus spoke constantly about love, mercy, forgiveness. He ate with tax collectors and sinners, defended the woman caught in adultery, welcomed children, and reserved his harshest words for religious leaders who placed heavy burdens on people's shoulders. The Jesus in the Bible seemed nothing like the organization I'd been serving. Where was the love in disfellowshipping a depressed young woman for seeking comfort? Where was the mercy in demanding that families shun their own children? Where was the forgiveness in the elaborate judicial processes that could destroy someone's entire social support system overnight? I started paying closer attention during our elder meetings. The circuit overseer would visit quarterly, bringing instructions from the branch office about how to handle various situations. These weren't suggestions for prayerful consideration. They were directives to be followed without question. When local elders expressed concerns about specific cases, they were reminded of their duty to support organizational decisions, whether they understood them or not. Obedience was valued above conscience, conformity above compassion. The breaking point came 6 months later, in the spring of 2019. A letter arrived at the Kingdom Hall, marked confidential and addressed to the body of elders. Inside was a detailed account from a mother named Patricia, describing how her 8-year-old daughter had been sexually abused by her own grandfather, a well-respected elder in a neighboring congregation. Patricia had reported the abuse to the local elders, expecting swift action and protection for her child. Instead, she'd been told that without 2 witnesses to the abuse, they couldn't take action against the grandfather. She was advised to pray about the situation and wait on Jehovah to resolve it. Meanwhile, the grandfather continued serving as an elder, giving talks from the platform, conducting Bible studies, and having unsupervised access to other children in the congregation. Patricia's attempts to warn other parents were met with accusations of slander and threats of disfellowshipping for causing divisions. The local body of elders had followed organizational policy to the letter, but a child remained in danger while her abuser maintained his position of trust and authority. Reading that letter, I felt something break inside me. This wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding of policy. This was the system working exactly as designed. The organization's reputation mattered more than a child's safety. Maintaining the facade of spiritual purity was more important than protecting the vulnerable. The 2-witness rule, originally intended to prevent false accusations in ancient Israel, had become a shield for predators in modern times. I couldn't sleep that night, I kept thinking about all the judicial committees I'd served on, all the decisions I'd made in the name of organizational loyalty. How many people had I hurt? How many families had I destroyed? How many victims had I silenced? The weight of it pressed down on me like a physical burden, making it hard to breathe. The following Monday morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called in sick to work and drove to the neighboring town where Patricia lived. I needed to hear her story firsthand, not filtered through organizational protocols or elder meeting summaries. When I knocked on her door, she opened it cautiously, her face etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle nobody wants to acknowledge exists. Patricia was a woman in her early 40s, thin from stress, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her living room was sparse but clean, children's toys scattered across the worn carpet. Her daughter Emma was at school, she explained, but the trauma was evident everywhere. Extra locks on doors, curtains drawn tight against the daylight, a vigilance in Patricia's eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant fear. She told me everything, how her father-in-law, Elder Robert Thompson, had been abusing Emma for months during family visits. How Emma had finally found the courage to tell her mother what Grandpa had been doing in the spare bedroom while the adults visited downstairs. How Patricia had immediately confronted Robert, who denied everything with the practiced indignation of a man accustomed to being believed without question. How she'd then taken her concerns to the local body of elders, expecting protection and justice for her child. Instead, she'd encountered a wall of bureaucratic indifference, masquerading as spiritual wisdom. The elders listened politely to her, took notes, and then explained the two-witness rule as if she'd never heard of it before. Without another person who had witnessed the abuse, they couldn't take judicial action against Robert. They could encourage him to step down temporarily if he chose to, but they couldn't remove him from his position or restrict his access to children. More disturbing still, they advised Patricia not to go to the police, reminding her that bringing reproach upon Jehovah's organization was itself a serious offense. Patricia's voice broke as she described the months that followed. Robert continued serving as an elder, giving talks about moral purity, while privately threatening to destroy Patricia's family if she continued making accusations. The other elders treated her with polite coolness, their body language making it clear they considered her a troublemaker. When she tried to warn other parents discreetly, word got back to the elder body, and she was called in for counseling about causing divisions in the congregation. Meanwhile, Emma was suffering. The 8-year-old had nightmares, refused to visit extended family, and began having panic attacks whenever Robert was present at meetings. Patricia begged the elders to at least ensure that Robert was never alone with children during congregation activities, but was told that such restrictions would be tantamount to admitting guilt and could result in legal liability for the organization. As I listened to Patricia's account, I felt something inside me snap. This wasn't just organizational failure, this was systematic protection of predators at the expense of children. The very policies I'd spent decades defending and implementing were designed not to protect the innocent, but to protect the institution. The two-witness rule, the prohibition against reporting to authorities, the emphasis on organizational reputation over victim safety. It was all deliberate, all calculated to maintain control while avoiding accountability. That evening, I sat in my study, surrounded by organizational manuals, letters from the branch office, and judicial committee guidelines I'd followed faithfully for over 2 decades. Reading them with new eyes, I saw patterns I'd been blind to before. Every policy seemed designed to consolidate power in the hands of appointed men while silencing dissent and criticism. The elaborate hierarchy of circuit overseers, district overseers, and branch committees created multiple layers of insulation between the governing body and the consequences of their decisions. I pulled out the Watchtower publications that had shaped my thinking for so many years. The language was subtle but unmistakable. Constant references to the dangers of independent thinking, the spiritual dangers of questioning organizational decisions, the importance of waiting on Jehovah rather than taking independent action. Members were taught to distrust their own judgment, to suppress their consciences when they conflicted with organizational directives, to view criticism of the organization as spiritual weakness or satanic influence. The next Sunday, I sat in the Kingdom Hall, listening to the same talks, the same songs, the same ritualized expressions of loyalty I'd participated in thousands of times before. But everything felt different now. The circuit overseer was visiting, delivering his standard presentation about the importance of unity and obedience. He spoke passionately about the dangers of apostasy, defining it not as rejection of God or Christ, but as any criticism of the governing body or organizational policies. During the question and answer session, I found myself studying the faces around me. These were good people, sincere people, many of whom I'd known for decades. They raised their hands eagerly to comment, parroting the same phrases they'd been taught to use, their answers indistinguishable from the printed material we were studying. They'd been trained to think in predetermined patterns, to express only approved thoughts, to mistake conformity for spirituality. After the meeting, I approached Brother Johnson about Patricia's situation. His response was everything I'd come to expect. Patient explanations about organizational procedures, reminders about the two-witness rule, gentle suggestions that I was letting emotion cloud my judgment. When I pressed him about the possibility of making an exception for child safety, his tone grew firmer. The branch office had provided clear guidance on these matters, he reminded me. Our job wasn't to second-guess theocratic arrangements, but to trust in Jehovah's organization and follow established procedures. That conversation crystallized something that had been building in my mind for months. I realized that I was no longer just questioning specific policies. I was questioning the entire foundation of organizational authority. If the governing body could be wrong about something as fundamental as protecting children, what else might they be wrong about? If following their directions could result in continued abuse of innocence, how could they claim to be God's exclusive channel of communication? Margaret noticed my growing distance from organizational activities. When I started missing elder meetings or arriving late to field service arrangements, she expressed concern about my spiritual well-being. Her responses to my questions about Patricia's situation were textbook perfect. We needed to trust in Jehovah's organization, wait patiently for his justice, and avoid being stumbled by imperfect human policies. She meant well, but her words felt like prison bars closing around any possibility of independent thought or moral action. I began researching the organization's history in ways I'd never done before. Using the local library's internet access and books that weren't in our Kingdom Hall library, I discovered a pattern of failed predictions, doctrinal reversals, and covered-up scandals that stretched back to the organization's founding. The same men who claimed divine guidance had predicted the end of the world repeatedly. 1914, 1925, 1975, always finding ways to explain away their failures while maintaining their authority over followers. More disturbing were the documented cases of child abuse cover-ups in other countries, court records that showed organizational lawyers fighting to protect the institution rather than victims, internal memos that revealed a calculated strategy of damage control rather than genuine concern for the welfare of children. The Australian Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse had uncovered over 1,000 unreported cases within the organisation. Yet the governing body continued to defend their policies as biblical and necessary. By December of 2019, I knew I'd reached a point of no return. I couldn't continue serving as an elder, enforcing policies I now recognized as harmful while maintaining my integrity. I couldn't keep sitting in judicial committees, potentially destroying more lives. In the name of organizational loyalty, I couldn't continue preaching door to door, telling people that our organization alone represented God's truth, when I'd seen evidence of systematic deception and cover-up at the highest levels. The weight of this knowledge was crushing me. Every meeting felt like an exercise in hypocrisy. Every talk I gave from the platform felt like a lie. Every time someone sought my counsel as an elder, I wondered whether my advice would help them or harm them in ways I couldn't foresee. The cognitive dissonance between what I believed in my heart and what I was expected to teach was tearing me apart, but I also knew what speaking out would cost me. I'd seen what happened to others who'd raised questions about organizational policies. They were labeled apostates, cut off from family and friends, treated as if they'd died. Their decades of faithful service were forgotten, their contributions dismissed, their very existence erased from the collective memory of the congregation. The social death that awaited anyone who challenged the system was designed to be so complete, so devastating, that most people chose silence over integrity. As Christmas lights began appearing in my neighbors' windows, lights that my own family would never display because the organization had taught us that such celebrations were pagan, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I would no longer be silent about what I'd discovered. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, I would speak the truth about the organization I'd served for over 2 decades. The little girl in Patricia's house and countless others like her deserved more than bureaucratic indifference disguised as spiritual guidance. Before I continue with the next part of my story, I want to pause here and connect with you personally. If you're listening to this, chances are something in my words has touched a place in your heart where your own questions live. Maybe you've seen things that didn't add up, heard stories that made you uncomfortable, or felt that knot in your stomach when official explanations didn't match what your conscience was telling you. You're not alone in those feelings, and you're not wrong to have them. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit that the questions we've been taught to suppress might actually be pointing us toward truth. I'd love to hear your own thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story matters just as much as mine does. And if this conversation is helping you process your own journey, please consider subscribing to hear how this story unfolds. Because what happened next changed everything, not just for me, but for my entire family and community. The first week of January 2020, I made the phone call that would seal my fate. I dialed the number for the branch office in Warwick, New York, and asked to speak with someone in the service department about a serious matter involving child protection policies. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached a cold, professional voice that identified himself as Brother Stevens from the legal department. I explained Patricia's situation carefully, methodically, without emotion or accusation. I described the abuse, the grandfather's position as an elder, the local body's adherence to the 2-witness rule, and the continued danger to children in the congregation. I suggested that perhaps the branch office wasn't aware of how their policies were being applied at the local level, that maybe there was room for adjustment when child safety was at stake. Brother Stevens listened without interruption, then responded with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd fielded similar calls many times before. He explained that the 2-witness rule was based on biblical precedent found in Deuteronomy and Matthew, that the organization couldn't abandon scriptural principles even in difficult situations, and that local bodies of elders were trained to handle such matters according to established procedures. When I pressed him about the possibility of making exceptions for child protection, his tone grew noticeably cooler. He reminded me of my oath as an elder to support organizational decisions whether I personally understood them or not. He suggested that my concerns might be evidence of prideful thinking, the kind of independent spirit that had led to problems in other congregations. He recommended that I discuss my concerns with my circuit overseer and focus on strengthening my own faith, rather than questioning theocratic arrangements. The conversation ended with what felt like a veiled threat disguised as spiritual counsel. That phone call confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. The policies weren't mistakes or oversights that could be corrected through reasonable discussion. They were deliberate choices made by men who prioritized institutional protection over individual welfare. The branch office wasn't interested in hearing about problems with their system. They were interested in maintaining compliance with their directives, regardless of the human cost. The next Sunday, our circuit overseer, Brother Martinez, was scheduled to give his quarterly visit address. I'd known Martinez for over a decade, had worked with him on numerous congregational matters, and considered him a friend as well as a spiritual superior. Surely he would understand my concerns about child protection policies. Surely he would see the moral imperative of putting safety before bureaucracy. After the meeting, I approached Martinez privately and requested a few minutes of his time. We walked to the second schoolroom in the back of the Kingdom Hall, the same room where I'd conducted countless judicial committee meetings over the years. The irony wasn't lost on me as I found myself on the other side of the power dynamic for the first time in my life as an elder. I laid out everything I'd discovered about Patricia's case and the broader patterns I'd identified in organizational policy. Martinez listened with the same neutral expression I'd seen him use with congregation members who'd brought him problems in the past. When I finished speaking, he closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and began what sounded like a rehearsed response. He acknowledged that dealing with child abuse accusations was one of the most challenging aspects of congregational oversight. He emphasized the importance of following scriptural guidelines, even when they seemed difficult to understand or implement. He reminded me that Jehovah's ways were higher than human ways, and that the organization's policies were based on careful study of biblical principles by spiritually mature men who had God's Spirit guiding their decisions. But then Martinez did something that caught me completely off guard. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and spoke with a candor I'd never heard from him before. He told me that he'd encountered similar situations in other congregations, that the struggle between protecting children and following organizational policy kept him awake at night sometimes. He admitted that he'd questioned some of the directives that came down from the branch office, but had ultimately concluded that his job was to implement policy, not to evaluate its wisdom or morality. Martinez's confession should have made me feel less alone, but instead it filled me with a deeper sense of despair. Here was a man with authority over dozens of congregations, someone who could potentially influence policy at higher levels, and even he felt powerless to challenge a system he privately questioned. If someone in his position couldn't or wouldn't advocate for change, what hope was there for reform from within? He ended our conversation with advice that would haunt me for weeks afterward. He suggested that I was experiencing a crisis of faith that could be resolved through increased study of organizational publications, more time in field service, and deeper immersion in theocratic activities. He recommended that I avoid dwelling on cases like Patricia's, which could stumble my faith and make me less effective as an elder. Most disturbingly, he warned me that expressing doubts about organizational policies to other congregation members could be considered apostasy, with all the consequences that label carried. Walking home from that meeting, I realized I'd reached a crossroads that would define not just my future, but my fundamental identity as a person. I could continue serving as an elder, enforcing policies, I now recognized as harmful, maintaining my position and relationships at the cost of my conscience. Or I could speak out publicly about what I'd discovered, knowing that doing so would cost me everything I'd built over the past quarter century. The weight of that choice was overwhelming. Margaret and I had invested our entire adult lives in the organization. Our social circle consisted entirely of Jehovah's Witnesses. Our financial planning assumed continued involvement in congregational activities rather than worldly pursuits like higher education or career advancement. Our identity as a family was inextricably linked to our status within the organization. Speaking out wouldn't just cost me my position as an elder, it would obliterate the foundation of everything we'd built together. But Patricia's daughter Emma haunted my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face in my mind, a little girl whose innocence had been stolen while the men charged with protecting her followed bureaucratic procedures designed to shield her abuser. How many other children were suffering in silence because the organization's reputation mattered more than their safety? How many families were being destroyed by policies that prioritized institutional control over human compassion? I began documenting everything I could find about the organization's handling of abuse cases. Using the Kingdom Hall's computer when no one else was around, I printed copies of letters from the branch office outlining procedures for dealing with accusations against elders. I photocopied pages from the secret manual given only to elders, highlighting sections that explicitly discouraged reporting abuse to authorities. I gathered testimonies from other parents who'd encountered similar situations, building a case file that revealed the systematic nature of the problem. The more evidence I compiled, the clearer it became that Patricia's situation wasn't an aberration. It was standard operating procedure. The organization had developed elaborate mechanisms for protecting accused elders while silencing their accusers. Victims were routinely blamed for their own abuse, told that their failure to scream loudly enough or fight hard enough made them complicit in their victimization. Families were torn apart by policies that demanded absolute loyalty to the organization over natural affection for relatives who questioned official procedures. By February, I'd made my decision. I would present everything I'd discovered to the next quarterly business meeting of our congregation's body of elders. I would demand that we break with branch office policy and report Robert Thompson to local authorities. I would insist that child protection take precedence over organizational reputation. And if the other elders refused to act, I would take my evidence public, regardless of the personal consequences. The night before that fateful elder meeting, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Margaret slept beside me. She'd sensed my growing distance from organizational activities, but attributed it to stress at work, or perhaps a spiritual low that increased study and service would eventually resolve. She had no idea that in less than 24 hours, her husband's decision would set in motion events that would destroy the life we'd built together and transform us from a respected elder family into congregational outcasts. I thought about our children, Sarah and Daniel, both of whom had structured their entire lives around organizational expectations. Sarah had turned down scholarship opportunities to attend college, choosing instead to pioneer and marry young within the organization. Daniel had sacrificed career prospects to serve at Bethel, returning home with no marketable skills, but absolute faith in the organization's guidance. How would they react when their father was branded an apostate? How would they choose between loyalty to family and loyalty to the organization that had shaped their worldview since childhood? But then I thought about Emma again, and all the other children like her whose suffering had been deemed acceptable collateral damage in the organization's quest to maintain its facade of spiritual purity. I thought about the parents who'd been silenced by threats of disfellowshipping when they tried to protect their children from known predators. I thought about the elaborate system of control and manipulation that kept millions of sincere people trapped in an organization that prioritized its own survival over their welfare. As dawn broke on that cold February morning, I knew there was no turning back. The man who'd been Elder Raymond Mitchell for over 2 decades was about to make a choice that would end his life as he'd known it, but might save other children from the nightmare that Emma had endured. I got dressed, put on my best suit and tie one last time, and prepared to walk into a meeting that would cost me everything I'd ever held dear. But for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: the peace that comes from knowing you're finally ready to do what's right, regardless of the price. The elder meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in February 2020. I arrived at the Kingdom Hall 30 minutes early, carrying a manila folder that contained copies of every document, letter, and testimony I'd gathered over the past months. The building felt different that night. Not like the sanctuary I'd known for decades, but like a courthouse where I was about to present evidence that would condemn an entire system of governance I'd once revered. Brother Johnson arrived first, followed by Brother Williams, then Martinez, who'd driven down from his circuit headquarters specifically for this meeting. They chatted casually about congregation statistics and upcoming circuit assembly assignments, while I sat silently reviewing my notes one final time. None of them suspected that within the next hour, their comfortable world of unquestioned authority and organizational loyalty would be shattered by one of their own. When Johnson called the meeting to order with a prayer asking for Jehovah's guidance in our deliberations, I felt the bitter irony of invoking God's blessing on proceedings I knew would prioritize institutional protection over divine justice. As soon as he said "Amen," I requested permission to address a matter of urgent concern that affected not just our congregation, but the safety of children throughout the organization. I began by reading Patricia's letter aloud. Every devastating detail of her daughter's abuse and the local elder's response. The room grew progressively quieter as I described Robert Thompson's continued service as an elder, despite credible accusations of child sexual abuse. Johnson interrupted twice to remind me about confidentiality concerns, but I pressed forward, explaining how organizational policy had effectively protected a predator while silencing his victim. Then I opened my folder and began distributing copies of the evidence I'd compiled. Internal memoranda from the legal department instructing elders to avoid involving secular authorities in abuse cases. Excerpts from the secret elder manual outlining procedures designed to minimize organizational liability rather than maximize child protection. Testimonies from other families who'd encountered identical responses when reporting abuse by appointed men. The silence that followed was deafening. Martinez stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. Williams kept shaking his head, muttering about how this couldn't be accurate, how there must be some misunderstanding. Johnson's face had gone completely white, his hands trembling as he leafed through page after page of evidence that contradicted everything he'd been taught about the organization's commitment to protecting the innocent. Finally, Martinez found his voice. He accused me of conducting unauthorized research into organizational policies, of exceeding my authority as a local elder, of possibly violating my confidentiality agreements with the branch office. He demanded to know where I'd obtained copies of confidential correspondence, how I'd gained access to legal memoranda that weren't distributed to congregation elders, why I was compiling evidence like some kind of prosecutor building a case against the organization I'd sworn to defend. I explained that everything I'd gathered was either publicly available through court records or had been provided by other elders who shared my concerns about child protection policies. I emphasized that I wasn't attacking the organization maliciously, but trying to address systematic problems that were putting children at risk. I proposed that we could work together to advocate for policy changes that would prioritize victim safety over institutional reputation. But even as I spoke, I could see in their faces that my appeals were falling on deaf ears. These men had spent decades learning to suppress their own moral instincts in favor of organizational loyalty. They'd been trained to view any criticism of branch office policies as spiritual weakness at best, apostasy at worst. The cognitive dissonance between the evidence before them and their lifetime of indoctrination was simply too great to overcome in a single evening. Johnson was the first to recover from the initial shock. He reminded me that local elders weren't authorized to question policies established by the governing body, that our role was to implement decisions made by more spiritually mature men who had access to divine guidance that we lacked. He suggested that my research demonstrated a dangerous spirit of independence that could spread to other congregation members if left unchecked. Williams joined in, questioning whether my concerns about Patricia's situation might be motivated by personal animosity toward Robert Thompson rather than genuine worry about organizational policy. He pointed out that accusations of child abuse were serious matters that required careful investigation, not emotional reactions based on one-sided testimonies. He reminded me that Satan often used seemingly compassionate concerns to introduce apostatic thinking into congregations, but it was Martinez's response that cut deepest. He acknowledged that child protection was indeed a serious matter that deserved careful consideration. He admitted that some organizational policies might seem harsh when viewed through worldly perspectives. But then he explained that our primary responsibility as elders wasn't to protect individual members from harm, but to protect the entire organization from reproach that could stumble weak ones and impede the preaching work that would ultimately save millions of lives at Armageddon. Turkish twisted logic was breathtaking. A system that systematically protected child abusers was justified because exposing those abuses might damage the organization's reputation and reduce its effectiveness in recruiting new members. The welfare of actual children mattered less than the theoretical welfare of future converts who might be deterred from joining if they learned about organizational failures to address abuse. It was utilitarian morality at its most grotesque, sacrificing the innocent for the supposed greater good of institutional survival. I spent the next 2 hours methodically addressing every objection they raised. I cited scripture after scripture about protecting the vulnerable, defending the innocent, and prioritizing justice over reputation. I quoted Jesus' warnings about anyone who would harm children, Paul's instructions about removing wicked persons from the congregation, and the Hebrew prophet's condemnations of religious leaders who oppressed the powerless while maintaining facades of righteousness. But for every biblical argument I presented, they had organizational publications that reinterpreted those same scriptures in ways that supported existing policies. The Watchtower had spent over a century developing sophisticated theological justifications for whatever actions served their institutional interests. Every moral principle I invoked had been systematically neutered through layers of interpretation that ultimately deferred to organizational authority rather than individual conscience. As the meeting stretched past midnight, I realized that no amount of evidence or argumentation would convince them to break ranks with official policy. They weren't evil men. They were products of a system that had systematically trained them to distrust their own moral instincts in favor of institutional loyalty. The organization had successfully created a class of enforcers who would implement any policy, no matter how harmful, as long as it came with proper theological justification and administrative authority. Finally, Johnson called for a recess and asked me to step outside while the remaining elders deliberated about how to handle my concerns. I walked out into the February cold, knowing that my fate was being decided by men who valued organizational compliance more than child safety. 20 minutes later, they called me back inside for what I knew would be the final conversation of my career as a Jehovah's Witness elder. Martinez delivered their verdict with the solemn gravity of a judge pronouncing sentence. They decided that my research into organizational policies demonstrated a serious lack of faith in theocratic arrangements. My criticism of branch office procedures showed evidence of apostatic thinking that posed a danger to congregational unity. My demand that they break with official policy regarding child abuse cases revealed a prideful spirit that put personal judgment above organizational wisdom. They were removing me from my position as an elder immediately. They were recommending to the branch office that I be marked as spiritually weak and potentially dangerous to other congregation members. They were instructing me to destroy all copies of the materials I'd compiled and to cease any further research into organizational policies. If I complied with their instructions and demonstrated proper repentance for my rebellious attitude, I might eventually be considered for reinstatement to positions of responsibility within the congregation. But if I persisted in my criticisms, if I shared my concerns with other congregation members, if I took my evidence to secular authorities or media outlets, they would have no choice but to disfellowship me for apostasy. The threat was clear: submit to organizational authority, or lose everything I'd ever known and loved. My family, my friends, my entire social support system would be stripped away if I refused to silence my conscience about child protection policies. I looked at these three men who'd been my colleagues and friends for over 2 decades, men whose children had played with my children, men whose families had shared countless meals and vacations and life experiences with mine. Now they were offering me a stark choice between moral integrity and social survival, between protecting children I'd never met and preserving relationships I'd spent decades building. Standing there in that fluorescent-lit meeting room, surrounded by organizational manuals and policy guidelines that prioritized institutional reputation over human welfare, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I told them I couldn't destroy the evidence I'd compiled because other children's lives might depend on it someday. I told them I couldn't promise to remain silent about policies that protected predators while silencing victims. I told them that if following my conscience made me an apostate in their eyes, then I would wear that label with more pride than I'd ever felt wearing the title of elder. The meeting ended at 1:30 in the morning with handshakes that felt like funeral rituals. We all knew we'd never work together again, never share the camaraderie of organizational service again, never see each other as anything but adversaries in a battle between institutional loyalty and individual conscience. As I walked out of the Kingdom Hall for what I somehow knew would be the last time as a member in good standing, I felt simultaneously liberated and devastated by the choice I'd made. I drove home through empty streets at 2 in the morning, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The finality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. 23 years of faithful service, decades of friendships and community involvement, a lifetime of identity built around organizational loyalty, all of it was about to vanish because I'd refused to remain silent about policies that protected child abusers. Margaret was waiting up for me, sitting at the kitchen table in her bathrobe with a cup of cold coffee. She'd known something momentous was happening when I told her the elder meeting might run late, but nothing could have prepared her for what I was about to explain. I sat down across from her and began recounting the evening's events, watching. Her face changed from confusion to disbelief to something approaching horror as the implications became clear. She listened without interrupting as I described the evidence I'd presented, the elders' response, and the ultimatum they'd delivered. When I finished speaking, The silence stretched between us like a chasm opening in the foundation of our marriage. Finally, she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Raymond, what does this mean for us? For our family? For everything we've built together?" I explained that the elders would almost certainly follow through on their threat to disfellowship me for apostasy. Once that announcement was made from the platform, every Jehovah's Witness we'd ever known would be required to treat me as if I were dead. Our children would face impossible pressure to choose between their father and their faith community. Margaret herself would become a social pariah if she remained married to a disfellowshipped apostate. The conversation that followed was the most painful of our 30-year marriage. Margaret begged me to reconsider, to destroy the evidence I'd compiled, to apologize to the elders, and promise to remain silent about organizational policies. She reminded me of everything we'd sacrificed over the years to build our position within the organization. The career opportunities we'd passed up, the worldly relationships we'd abandoned, the financial security we'd foregone in favor of spiritual pursuits. She couldn't understand how I could throw it all away for the sake of strangers, people we'd never even met, who lived in other congregations, other states, other countries. Why should we destroy our family to protect children whose parents should be responsible for their own welfare? Why should we risk our eternal salvation to challenge policies that were established by men who claimed direct communication with God? I tried to explain that I couldn't live with myself, knowing that my silence enabled continued abuse of innocent children. I described Emma's face, Patricia's desperation, the systematic nature of organizational cover-ups that I'd uncovered. In my research, I quoted Jesus' words about millstones and deep seas for those who harm children, Paul's instructions about removing wicked persons from the congregation, the Hebrew prophets' condemnations of religious leaders who oppress the vulnerable. But Margaret had been trained by decades of organizational indoctrination to distrust such reasoning. She'd learned to suppress her own moral instincts in favor of institutional loyalty, to view criticism of organizational policies as evidence of spiritual weakness or satanic influence. Every argument I presented was filtered through layers of watchtower interpretation that ultimately deferred to organizational authority rather than individual conscience. By dawn, we'd reached an impasse that would define our relationship for years to come. Margaret couldn't accept that her husband's conscience might be more reliable than the governing body's guidance. I couldn't pretend that protecting our comfortable life within the organization mattered more than protecting children from systematic abuse. We were speaking different moral languages that no longer had any common ground for translation. The next 3 weeks passed in a surreal blur of normal daily activities overlaid with the constant awareness that everything was about to change irrevocably. I continued going to work, maintaining the pretense that my world wasn't falling apart, while waiting for the inevitable phone call summoning me to a judicial committee meeting. Margaret withdrew into herself, spending hours reading Watchtower publications and praying for guidance about how to handle her apostate husband. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in March. Brother Martinez informed me that a judicial committee had been formed to address my apostatic activities and determine whether disfellowshipping action was warranted. The meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday evening, with 3 elders from neighboring congregations serving on the committee to avoid conflicts of interest with our local body. I spent that weekend preparing for what I knew would be a show trial designed to justify a predetermined outcome. The organization had developed elaborate procedures for judicial committees that created an appearance of due process while ensuring that institutional interests always prevailed over individual concerns. The elders serving as judges had already been briefed about my crimes against organizational loyalty. Their job was simply to document my unrepentant attitude for the official record. Sunday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for early March. I put on my best suit one final time, not because I had any illusions about the outcome, but because I wanted to maintain my dignity during the proceedings that would formally end my life as a Jehovah's Witness. Margaret refused to drive with me to the Kingdom Hall, saying she couldn't bear to witness my final act of rebellion against God's organization. The Judicial Committee meeting lasted exactly 90 minutes. The three elders, men I'd known casually, for years through circuit assemblies and elder schools, went through the motions of investigating my apostatic activities. They asked about my research into organizational policies, my criticism of child protection procedures, my refusal to destroy evidence that could embarrass the organization. They gave me multiple opportunities to demonstrate repentance by acknowledging my errors and promising future compliance with theocratic arrangements. I used every minute they allowed me to speak, not because I thought I could change their minds, but because I wanted them to understand exactly why I was willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of abused children they would never meet. I explained how organizational policies systematically protected predators while silencing victims. I described the elaborate mechanisms the organization had developed to avoid accountability for institutional failures. I challenged them to explain how policies that enabled child abuse could possibly have divine approval. Their responses were everything I'd expected: patient explanations about the importance of organizational loyalty, reminders about the dangers of independent thinking, gentle suggestions that my concerns demonstrated spiritual weakness rather than moral courage. They weren't evil men, just products of a system that had trained them to prioritize institutional survival over individual welfare, to mistake compliance for righteousness, to view criticism as apostasy regardless of its factual basis or moral foundation. The verdict was announced with the solemn gravity appropriate for excommunicating someone from God's chosen organization. Raymond Mitchell was hereby disfellowshipped for apostasy, effective immediately. The announcement would be made at the next theocratic ministry school meeting, after which every Jehovah's Witness in good standing would be required to treat me as if I no longer existed. The social death sentence had been pronounced. All that remained was its execution. I walked out of that meeting feeling simultaneously devastated and liberated. Devastated because I was losing everything I'd known and loved for over 2 decades. Liberated because I was finally free to speak the truth without fear of organizational retaliation. The worst they could do to me had already been done. From this point forward, I could act according to my conscience without calculating the cost to my position within their hierarchical system. The announcement was made the following Thursday evening. Margaret attended that meeting and later described the stunned silence that followed the chairman's simple statement that Raymond Mitchell was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. People I'd known for decades, families I'd shepherded through crises, young people I'd mentored in their spiritual development, all of them were now forbidden from acknowledging my existence. I had become a non-person, erased from the collective memory of the community that had defined my adult life. The shunning began immediately and was more thorough than I'd anticipated. Former friends crossed the street to avoid passing me on the sidewalk. Colleagues at work who were Jehovah's Witnesses stopped speaking to me entirely, communicating only through intermediaries when business required interaction. My daughter, Sarah, called to inform me tearfully that she couldn't maintain contact without jeopardizing her own standing in the organization. My son Daniel sent a brief letter explaining that his love for Jehovah required him to treat his disfellowshipped father as dead until such time as I demonstrated proper repentance and was reinstated. But the most devastating loss was Margaret herself, the woman I'd been married to for 3 decades, who'd shared every major decision and life experience with me, gradually became a stranger living in the same house. She couldn't be seen socializing with me without damaging her own reputation. In the congregation, she couldn't discuss my concerns about organizational policies without risking her own spiritual standing. Our conversations became stilted exchanges about practical household matters, empty of the intimacy and partnership that had sustained our relationship for so many years. 6 months after my disfellowshipping, Margaret asked me to move out of our house. She explained that maintaining separate residences would make it easier for her to rebuild her standing in the congregation while still technically remaining married to an apostate. I rented a small apartment across town and began the process of reconstructing my entire identity outside the organizational framework that had defined me since my 30s. The isolation was crushing at first. Decades of organizational involvement had left me with no social connections outside the Jehovah's Witness community. I'd never developed hobbies or interests that weren't related to theocratic activities. I had no idea how to form friendships with worldly people who didn't share the religious vocabulary and cultural assumptions that had shaped my worldview for over 20 years. But slowly, painfully, I began to build a new life. I started attending a support group for former Jehovah's Witnesses and discovered that my experience wasn't unique. Dozens of other people had faced similar choices between conscience and community, had paid similar prices for refusing to remain silent about organizational failures. Their stories gave me perspective on my own situation and hope that healing was possible even after such devastating losses. I also began reaching out to journalists and researchers who were documenting the organization's systematic failures to protect children from abuse. My evidence became part of larger investigations that eventually resulted in legal action against the Watchtower Society in multiple countries. Seeing that my sacrifice had contributed to meaningful change, that other children might be protected because I'd refused to remain silent, gave purpose to the losses I'd endured. Most importantly, I reconnected with Patricia and her daughter Emma. The little girl was slowly healing from her trauma, aided by counseling that her mother had finally been able to arrange after breaking free from organizational control. Emma was attending public school, making friends outside the insular witness community, discovering interests and talents that would never have been nurtured within the restrictive environment she'd been raised in. Seeing her recovery gave meaning to everything I'd sacrificed to speak out on her behalf. 3 years have passed since that elder meeting changed everything. I'm 64 years old now, living alone in a modest apartment, working at a job that pays the bills without providing much satisfaction or purpose. I've lost my wife, my children, my friends, my community, my identity as a respected religious leader. By any conventional measure, speaking out against organizational policies cost me everything that made life worth living. But I sleep peacefully now in a way I never could during those final months as an elder, when I knew children were being harmed while I remained silent to protect my position. I wake up each morning knowing that I chose integrity over comfort, courage over convenience, moral principle over social acceptance. The price of breaking my silence was higher than I ever imagined it could be, but it was a price worth paying. 2. Anyone listening who might be facing similar choices, whether in religious organizations or any other context where institutional loyalty conflicts with moral conscience, I want you to know that you're not alone in your struggle. The decision to speak truth to power always comes with costs, but the cost of silence is ultimately much higher. Your voice matters, your conscience is trustworthy, and your courage to stand up for what's right can make a difference in ways you may never fully understand. Don't let anyone convince you that protecting the innocent is less important than protecting the reputation of institutions that have failed in their most basic moral obligations. Thank you for listening to my story, for allowing me to share the most difficult chapter of my life with you. If my experience has resonated with your own journey, or if you have questions about breaking free from controlling religious environments, Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters just as much as mine does. And together, we can support each other in living lives guided by conscience rather than institutional control. Consider subscribing to hear more stories of courage and transformation, because the world needs to know that choosing truth over comfort is always possible, even when the price seems impossibly high. And remember, you are stronger than you, no braver than you feel, and more capable of positive change than any organization that demands your silence could ever want you to believe.